The scorching summer heat bore down on Willow Vale as Willa Vaughn gripped the doctor's cold, metallic examination table, her knuckles turning white with strain. The news had pierced her heart like a bullet. She would never bear children. It was 1876 in Montezuma, Arizona territory, and for a 24-year-old woman, such a sentence felt like the end of everything she'd ever dreamed about. "I'm sorry, Miss Vaughn, Doctor," Henderson said, his voice betraying the practiced detachment of a man who had delivered similar news countless times before. "The scarlet fever you suffered last year has left significant scarring. It would be irresponsible to give you any false hope." Willa blinked back tears, refusing to let them fall. Not here. Not now. She'd done enough crying since arriving in this dust-blown frontier town 6 months ago after her parents' passing, leaving her their modest homestead just outside town. "Thank you for your honesty, Doctor," she managed, her voice steadier than she felt. "I appreciate knowing the truth." The streets of Montezuma were busy that afternoon, the main thoroughfare buzzing with activity. Horses and wagons kicked up dust that clung to Willa's simple blue calico dress as she walked away from the doctor's office, her mind swimming with grief. She hardly noticed the crowd gathering outside the saloon until she nearly collided with a towering figure. "Beg your pardon, madam," came a deep voice, rough as sandpaper but oddly gentle. Willa looked up and up further into the weathered face of a stranger. His eyes were the clear blue of a winter sky, startling against his sun-darkened skin. A cowboy, judging by his attire and the fine leather chaps that had seen many miles of hard riding. "My fault entirely," she murmured, stepping aside. "I wasn't watching where I was going." The stranger touched the brim of his hat respectfully. "Mason Holt," he introduced himself. "Just rode in with the cattle drive from Texas." "Willa Vaughn," she replied automatically, then hurried away before her emotions could betray her in front of this stranger. Behind her, she could feel his eyes following her progress down the street, but she didn't look back. She couldn't face kindness. Right now, kindness might break the fragile dam holding back her tears. The 2-mile walk to her homestead gave Willa time to compose herself. The small ranch had been her parents' pride, with its modest cabin, barn, and the struggling orchard her mother had planted with such optimism. Since their passing from influenza that winter, Willa had been fighting a lonely battle to keep it running. As she approached, she saw a figure on her porch, Mrs. Abernathy from the neighboring farm, rocking in the chair Willa's father had made, a basket at her feet. "There you are, child," the older woman called. "I brought some fresh bread and preserves. Figured you might need something after seeing the doctor." News traveled fast in Montezuma. "Thank you, Mrs. Abernathy," Willa said, climbing the steps. "That's very kind." The older woman's faded blue eyes studied her. "Well, what did old Henderson say about those fainting spells you've been having?" Willa's throat tightened. "Nothing serious, just need to eat more regularly." The lie came easily. She wasn't ready to speak the truth aloud that would make it real. "Good, good." Mrs. Abernathy patted her hand. "A young woman like you has to keep up her strength. Never know when the right fellow might come along wanting a wife." The innocent comment was like a knife to Willa's heart. She managed a tight smile and thanked Mrs. Abernathy again, waiting until the woman's wagon disappeared down the dusty road before allowing herself to collapse onto the porch steps, her body shaking with silent sobs. What man would want a barren wife? In a land where children were not just loved, but needed to work the farms, to carry on family names, to provide security in old age, she was damaged goods. The sun was setting when Willa finally rose, wiped her face, and went inside. The doctor's words echoed in her mind as she moved mechanically through her evening chores. By the time she climbed into bed that night, she had made a decision. She would continue running the homestead alone. She would not seek marriage, would not subject any man to a childless union. She would make her peace with solitude, but fate, as it often does in the wild frontier lands, had other plans. 3 days later, Willa was in town purchasing supplies when Sheriff Davies approached her outside the general store. "Miss Vaughn," he greeted her, tipping his hat. "Got someone asking about hiring on with a small ranch. Thought of your place." Willa frowned. "I can't afford to hire help, Sheriff. You know that. This fella's not asking for much. Just room, board, and a small wage when you can manage it. Says he's got experience with orchards, too." Willa hesitated. Her father's apple trees were struggling and she knew nothing about their care. "Who is it?" "New fella. Came in with the cattle drive. Mason Holt's his name." Recognition flashed. The tall cowboy she'd bumped into. Something in Willa rebelled at the idea of having a man on her property, her safe haven of solitude, but practicality won out. The orchard had been her mother's pride. If it died, another piece of her parents would be gone forever. "Send him out tomorrow morning," she said finally. "I'll hear what he has to say." The next morning dawned clear and hot. Willa was up before sunrise, feeding the chickens and milking her single cow. She'd just finished making breakfast when she heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching. Mason Holt rode a magnificent chestnut gelding, his tall frame comfortable in the saddle in a way that spoke of a lifetime spent on horseback. As he dismounted, Willa was struck again by his height and the breadth of his shoulders. His face was deeply tanned and weathered, though she guessed him to be no more than 30. "Miss Vaughn," he greeted her, removing his hat to reveal dark hair streaked with premature silver at the temples. "Sheriff Davies said you might have work." Willa nodded, keeping her distance. "He mentioned you know something about orchards." A small smile crinkled the corners of his eyes. "My pa had an apple orchard in Kentucky, grew up tending it before I took to the trail." "I can't pay much," she warned. "Maybe nothing at all until harvest." "I understand. I'm looking to put down roots somewhere quiet after 15 years driving cattle. Money's not my main concern right now." Willa studied him, searching for signs of deception, finding none. "There's a small room off the barn. It's not much, but it's dry." "More than I've had many nights," he said with a shrug. "When would you like me to start? Can you show me the orchard now? Tell me what you think." Mason nodded, and Willa led him to the 3 acres of apple trees her mother had lovingly planted. The trees stood in neat rows, but many looked sickly, their leaves yellowing. Mason walked among them, examining the soil, the bark, the leaves. His large hands were surprisingly gentle as they turned over the foliage. "Fire blight," he said finally. "Common problem. We can save most of them if we start today. Unless you'd rather I handle it alone." There was something in his tone, not condescension, but a genuine question. He wasn't assuming she couldn't or wouldn't help. "I want to learn," Willa said firmly. "They were my mother's trees." A look of understanding crossed his face. "Then I'll teach you everything I know." And so began an uneasy partnership. Mason moved into the small room by the barn, rising early and working late. Under his care, the apple trees began to recover. He fixed the sagging porch steps, repaired fences, and helped with the vegetable garden Willa maintained. They worked mostly in silence at first, Willa keeping a careful distance. But as the days passed, she found herself observing him when he wasn't looking, the careful way he handled the trees, the quiet competence in everything he did, the respect he showed for her property and her boundaries. She learned that he'd been orphaned young and raised by an uncle in Kentucky before striking out on his own at 16. He'd driven cattle from Texas to Kansas, fought in the war, prospected for gold in California, and finally decided he wanted a quieter life. "I've seen enough trouble to last several lifetimes," he told her one evening as they sat on the porch after dinner, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. Ready for some peace. Willa could understand that. In the month since Mason had arrived, a tentative friendship had formed between them. She still kept her grief private, still maintained certain barriers, but she found his presence increasingly comforting rather than intrusive. It was during the second month that trouble came to their quiet routine. Willa was in town collecting mail when Silas Warner, son of the wealthiest rancher in the area, cornered her outside the post office. "Miss Vaughn," he said, his voice carrying the entitlement of a man used to getting his way. "I heard you've got a drifter staying at your place." "Mr. Holt works for me," she replied coolly. "He's helping restore my orchard." Warner's laugh held no humor. "Is that what they're calling it these days? A young woman living alone with a man of questionable character. People are talking." Willa felt heat rise to her face. "What Mr. Holt and I do is none of your concern, Mr. Warner. It is when my father's been trying to buy your worthless piece of land for months. Now I hear you're fixing it up." His voice hardened. "My advice? Sell to us before things get difficult." Willa stepped back. "Your father made an insultingly low offer for land that's been in my family for years." "My answer remains no." Warner moved closer. "Think carefully, Miss Vaughn. A woman alone faces many dangers in these parts. She's not alone." The deep voice came from behind Warner, who turned to find Mason standing there, his expression dangerously calm. "This isn't your business, Cowboy," Warner sneered. "Miss Vaughn's safety is very much my business," Mason replied evenly. "And I don't take kindly to threats against my employer." Something in Mason's stance, the coiled readiness, the absolute certainty in his eyes made Warner step back. "This isn't over," he muttered before stalking away. Willa released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Thank you." Mason's eyes softened as they met hers. "Are you all right?" "Yes. They've been after my land since before my parents died. The northeast corner borders their property, and there's a year-round spring there." "Water rights," Mason nodded, understanding immediately. "Valuable in these parts. My father refused to sell. I'll do the same." Mason offered his arm, an unexpected gesture. "May I walk you home, Miss Vaughn?" The formality made her smile despite her rattled nerves. "I think after defending me from bullies, you might call me Willa." His answering smile transformed his face, softening the hard edges. "Willa, then." They walked arm in arm back to the homestead, a new kind of awareness humming between them. That night, sitting on the porch after dinner had become their routine, Mason seemed unusually pensive. "Something on your mind?" Willa asked. He hesitated before speaking. "Warner's threats shouldn't be taken lightly. His father has a reputation for getting what he wants by whatever means necessary. I won't be bullied off my land." "I admire your determination," Mason said quietly, "but I'm concerned. Would you consider letting me move my bedroll to the porch at night, just as a precaution?" The idea of having him sleeping just outside her door should have alarmed her. Instead, Willa felt a wave of relief. "If you think it's necessary." "I do. Just until we're sure Warner's not planning anything." That night, Willa slept more soundly than she had in months, knowing Mason was nearby. The Warner's threats remained just that, threats, for several weeks. Life fell into a pleasant rhythm. Mason continued restoring the orchard, and under his care, the trees blossomed, promising a good harvest. He taught Willa everything he knew about apple cultivation, and she found herself looking forward to their lessons, to the sound of his voice explaining grafting techniques or pest management. Sometimes she caught him watching her with an expression she couldn't or wouldn't interpret. In those moments, her heart would beat a little faster, and she'd remind herself firmly of the doctor's diagnosis, of her decision to remain alone. But fate intervened again one stormy night in late summer. The rain had been falling steadily all day, turning to a downpour by evening. Willa was in the kitchen preparing supper when she heard Mason shout her name, panic edging his voice. She ran to the door to find him soaking wet, holding something in his arms, a small, bedraggled puppy. "Found him by the creek," Mason explained, water streaming from his hat. "Creek's rising fast. Must have been abandoned." The puppy was shivering violently, its tiny body cold to the touch. Without hesitation, Willa took the animal, wrapping it in a kitchen towel and rubbing it vigorously. "Get yourself dry," she ordered Mason. "There's a fire in the fireplace. I'll tend to this little one." For the next hour they worked together to save the puppy, warming it, feeding it watered-down milk, making a bed from an old blanket near the fire. The tiny creature was weak but fighting, its eyes barely open. "He's so young," Willa whispered, stroking the puppy's now dry fur. "Who would leave something so helpless?" Mason, sitting beside her on the floor in front of the fire, shook his head. "Some folks don't value life the way they should." The simple statement, delivered in his deep, gentle voice, brought unexpected tears to Willa's eyes. The puppy whimpered and she bent her head to hide her emotion. "Hey," Mason said softly, his hand coming to rest lightly on her shoulder. "What is it?" The kindness in his voice broke something in her. Months of held-back grief and shame spilled out in a rush. "I can't have children," she confessed, the words painful in her throat. "The doctor told me, scarlet fever last year, there's damage that can't be fixed." She couldn't look at him. "I can never give life to anything." Mason was silent for a long moment, his hand still on her shoulder. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "Willa, look at me." Reluctantly, she raised her eyes to his. "You've already brought me life," he said simply. She blinked in confusion. "I was drifting," he explained, "moving from place to place, not really living, just existing." His hand moved to cover hers where it rested on the puppy. "Then I met you, saw how you faced each day with courage, despite your grief, despite being alone. You gave me purpose again. Hope." Willa couldn't speak, couldn't process what she was hearing. "A person's worth isn't measured by their ability to bear children," Mason continued, his gaze steady on hers. "It's measured by the life they breathe into everything around them. Like you've done with this homestead, like you're doing right now with this pup." The puppy chose that moment to stir, letting out a tiny yawn that made them both smile. "See," Mason said softly, "life finds a way." That night marked a turning point. The walls Willa had built around her heart began to crumble, stone by stone. The puppy, which they named Chance, survived and thrived, becoming a constant companion as they worked the land together. And something else grew, something neither of them spoke about but both felt, a tender connection strengthening with each passing day. Autumn arrived, bringing with it the apple harvest. The trees, once sickly, now bore fruit in abundance. Mason constructed a cider press, and together they turned much of the harvest into cider to sell in town, providing Willa with more income than she'd had since her parents' deaths. It was during the harvest that Mason finally spoke of feelings that had been building between them. They were working side by side, picking apples on a perfect fall day when Mason paused, an apple in his hand, his expression suddenly serious. "Willa," he said, his voice rougher than usual, "I need to say something." She waited, her heart suddenly racing. "I came here looking for peace, for a place to belong." He turned the apple in his hands, a nervous gesture she'd never seen from him before. "I found that, and something I wasn't looking for, something I thought I'd never find." "What's that?" she asked, barely breathing. Love. The word hung in the air between them. I've fallen in love with you, Willa Vaughn. I don't expect you to feel the same. I know you've had your heart set on solitude, but I couldn't keep working alongside you every day without being honest. Willa's hands trembled as she set down her basket of apples. Mason, you don't have to answer now, he said quickly, or ever if you don't want to. Nothing has to change if you don't want it to. But everything already has changed, she whispered. Hope flickered in his eyes. What do you mean? When you found me, I was empty, just going through the motions of living. She took a step toward him. You brought the orchard back to life, and somehow along the way you did the same for me. Mason set his apple carefully in the basket, then reached for her hands. Are you saying what I think you're saying? I'm saying I love you too, Willa admitted, the words both terrifying and liberating. But Mason, you need to understand I can never give you children, if that matters to you. He shook his head, cutting her off. What matters to me is you. Just you, Willa. When he kissed her, it felt like coming home, like all the broken pieces inside her were not fixed exactly, but rearranged into something new and whole and beautiful. Their happiness, however, was soon tested. 2 weeks after their declaration, Mason rode into town to sell the last of their cider. He returned with a grim expression and troubling news. Warner's men were in the saloon, talking freely. He told her as they sat at the kitchen table. They're planning something. Said Warner's father is tired of waiting for you to sell. Willa's hands clenched. What kind of something? Didn't say specifically, but one mentioned making sure you'd be glad to leave when the time comes. That night, they took turns keeping watch. Nothing happened, nor the next night or the one after. A week passed, then 2. They began to hope the threats were just drunken boasting. Then came the fire. It started near midnight, a small blaze at first, set in the dry grass near the barn. If not for Chance's frantic barking, they might not have discovered it until too late. Mason was first outside, Willa close behind. The fire was spreading quickly toward the barn where their harvest was stored. Get the buckets, Mason shouted, already running for the well. For the next hour, they fought desperately against the flames, forming a bucket brigade from the well to the fire's edge. Eventually, they managed to contain and extinguish it, but not before it had destroyed a section of fence and scorched the outer wall of the barn. Exhausted and smoke-stained, they surveyed the damage in the gray light of dawn. It was deliberate, Mason said, pointing to where the fire had started. Multiple points of origin. Willa's face hardened with determination. We need to speak to the sheriff. Sheriff Davies listened to their story with a troubled expression, but shook his head regretfully. I can't prove the Warners were behind it, he said. Their ranch hands were all accounted for at the bunkhouse last night, according to the foreman. They could have hired someone, Mason argued. Without evidence, my hands are tied, Davies insisted, but I'll keep an eye out, make extra patrols past your place. As they left his office, Willa's shoulders slumped in defeat. He won't help us, she said. The Warners contribute too much to this town. Mason put his arm around her. Then we'll help ourselves. Over the next few days, they reinforced their defenses. Mason dug a fire break around the property. They took turns keeping watch at night. Chance proved an excellent sentinel, his hearing far keener than theirs, but the strain began to show. Willa grew pale from lack of sleep. Mason's face took on a haunted quality as he constantly scanned the horizon for threats. We can't live like this forever, Willa said one evening as they ate a hasty supper. Mason nodded, his expression grim. I've been thinking the same. What do we do? He hesitated. I think we need to confront them directly. The Warners, alarm colored her voice. That's too dangerous. Not necessarily. I've been asking around town. Old man Warner is actually a reasonable man, according to some. It's his son Silas who's the hothead. So what are you suggesting? I go speak to Warner Sr. directly, man to man. Willa shook her head vehemently. No, we don't know if he's behind this or if Silas is acting on his own. It's too risky. Then we keep living under siege. Mason's voice rose slightly in frustration. Watching our backs every minute, jumping at shadows. They were interrupted by Chance's sudden barking, not his usual greeting bark, but a sound of alarm. Mason was on his feet instantly, reaching for the rifle he kept by the door. Stay here. No. Willa grabbed her father's old shotgun. We face this together. Outside, they could see a group of riders approaching 5 men, their faces indistinct in the fading light. Get behind me, Mason ordered, but Willa stood her ground beside him. As the riders drew closer, she recognized Silas Warner at the lead. The others were ranch hands she'd seen in town. All were armed. Evening, Miss Vaughn, Warner called, reining in his horse about 20 feet from the porch. Thought we might continue our conversation about your property. Nothing to discuss, Willa replied steadily. My land is not for sale. Warner's smile didn't reach his eyes. I think you'll reconsider unless you want more accidents to befall your little homestead. Mason stepped forward, his rifle raised. You're trespassing, Warner. I suggest you leave. Warner laughed. Or what? You'll shoot all of us. He looked at his companions. 4 against 1. Bad odds, Cowboy. Make that 3 against 2, came a new voice from the darkness. Sheriff Davies rode into view, his deputy beside him. Heard there might be trouble out here tonight, the sheriff said casually, though his hand rested on his holstered pistol. Thought I'd check in. Warner's face contorted with anger. We're just having a friendly discussion, Sheriff. Discussions don't generally require 5 armed men after sundown, Davies observed dryly. Now, why don't you boys head on back to your ranch? I'd hate to have to explain to your father why his son got arrested for trespassing and making threats. For a tense moment, it seemed Warner might refuse. Then, with a muttered curse, he wheeled his horse around. This isn't over, he snapped at Willa before galloping away, his men following. Once they disappeared into the darkness, Willa released a shaky breath. Thank you, Sheriff. How did you know? Davies dismounted, a grim smile on his weathered face. Got word from an unlikely source, Elizabeth Warner, the old man's wife. Seems she overheard her son planning something tonight and sent her maid to warn me. He shook his head. She doesn't approve of Silas's methods, apparently. Will they come back? Mason asked. Not tonight. And I've sent word to Joseph Warner about his son's activities. Joseph's a hard businessman, but he's never tolerated outright lawlessness. I suspect Silas will find himself with a short leash for a while. The sheriff's prediction proved correct. The next day, a messenger arrived from the Warner ranch, bearing a letter addressed to Willa. The message was brief but clear. An apology from Joseph Warner for his son's behavior, and an assurance that there would be no further trouble. The offer to purchase her land remained open, but there would be no more pressure tactics. You believe him? Willa asked Mason after the messenger departed. Mason considered this. Joseph Warner built his empire through shrewd business, not violence. I think he means it. Silas is another matter, but if his fathers reined him in, then we might actually have peace, Willa finished. That night, for the first time in weeks, they both slept deeply, without taking turns to keep watch. As winter approached, life settled into a new pattern. The orchard was prepared for the cold months. They sold the last of their apples and cider at a handsome profit. Mason built shelves in the root cellar for Willa's preserves and began planning improvements for the coming spring. They spoke often of the future, their future, but had made no formal declarations. Willa sensed that Mason was waiting, giving her time, not wanting to rush her into a commitment she might not be ready for. But she was ready. The more time passed, the more certain she became that what they had built together was real and lasting. It was the first snowfall of winter when Willa finally broached the subject. They were sitting before the fireplace, Chance curled at their feet, watching the fat flakes drift past the window. "I've been thinking," she began, suddenly nervous. Mason turned to her, his expression open. "About us, the future." She took a deep breath. "I know we've talked around it, but I want to be your wife, Mason, if you still want that." The joy that spread across his face was answer enough, but his words, spoken with such certainty, made her heart soar. "I've wanted that since the day I realized I loved you," he said, taking her hands in his. "I was just waiting until you felt ready." "I'm ready," she whispered. "More than ready." Their wedding was a simple affair, held in the town church 2 weeks later. Mrs. Abernathy cried happy tears. Sheriff Davies gave the bride away. Even Dr. Henderson attended, his usual somber expression softened by the obvious happiness of the couple. As they exchanged vows, snow fell softly outside the church windows, blanketing Montezuma in pristine white, a new beginning, fresh and clean. Later, as Mason carried her over the threshold of what was now their home, Willa felt a completeness she had never expected to find after the doctor's devastating diagnosis. "Happy?" Mason asked, setting her down gently in their living room where a fire blazed cheerfully. "More than I ever thought possible," she admitted, "but I still worry sometimes. About that you'll regret not having children of your own." Mason took her face in his hands, his expression serious. "Willa, when I said you brought me life, I meant it. Before you, I was just existing. You gave me purpose, love, a home." He kissed her softly. "As for family, there are many children in this world who need homes, who need love, if that's something you want to consider someday." Hope unfurled in Willa's heart. "You'd want that. I want a life with you," he said simply. "Whatever form that takes." Spring came early that year, as if nature itself was celebrating their happiness. The apple trees blossomed magnificently. Willa planted an expanded vegetable garden. Mason built a larger chicken coop and bought additional hens. Their small homestead thrived under their combined care. It was during the late spring planting that Willa received an unexpected visitor, Elizabeth Warner, wife of Joseph and mother to Silas. The elegant older woman arrived in a handsome carriage, looking distinctly out of place at the modest homestead. "Mrs. Holt," she greeted Willa formally. "I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all," Willa assured her, though she was puzzled by the visit. "Would you like to come inside for tea?" Once settled in the small but comfortable living room, Elizabeth Warner came directly to the point. "I wanted to thank you personally for not pressing charges against my son last fall," she said, "and to apologize again for his behavior." "That's not necessary, Mrs. Warner. It's in the past." The older woman smiled sadly. "Perhaps, but there's another reason for my visit." She hesitated. "I understand from Dr. Henderson that you are unable to bear children." Willa stiffened. "That's rather personal information for the doctor to share." "I didn't hear it from him directly," Elizabeth clarified quickly. "Small towns, word travels, but it's relevant to why I'm here." She reached for her handbag. "There's a situation in town. A young woman, unmarried, expecting a child. She works in my household, Mary, one of our maids. The father was a traveling salesman who has long since disappeared." Willa's heart began to beat faster, understanding dawning. "Mary cannot keep the child," Elizabeth continued. "Her family has disowned her and a maid with an illegitimate baby." She shook her head. "I've been trying to find a good home for the child. When I heard about your situation, I thought perhaps—" "You want us to take the baby," Willa whispered. "Only if you wish to," Elizabeth said quickly. Mary is due in about 2 months. The child would be yours in every way that matters. A legal adoption with papers drawn up by our family lawyer. Willa's mind raced. I would need to speak with my husband, of course. Elizabeth rose. Take all the time you need. The offer stands regardless of your decision about the land. This is entirely separate. After Elizabeth left, Willa sat for a long time, her hands trembling with emotion. When Mason returned from the fields, she told him everything. His reaction was immediate and unequivocal. "Yes," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "If you want this, then so do I." "It won't be easy," Willa cautioned. "A baby changes everything." Mason's smile was radiant. "Good things often aren't easy, but they're worth it." The next 2 months passed in a flurry of preparation. Mason converted the small second bedroom into a nursery, building a cradle with his own hands. Willa sewed tiny garments and blankets. The whole town buzzed with the news, and gifts began appearing on their doorstep: a handmade quilt from Mrs. Abernathy, a rocking chair from Sheriff Davies, baby clothes from various townswomen. On a sweltering day in late July, Elizabeth Warner's carriage appeared again. This time, she carried a small bundle wrapped in a fine white blanket. "Mary delivered a healthy girl 3 days ago," she explained as Willa invited her inside. "She's been fed and changed, but she'll be hungry again soon." With trembling hands, Willa accepted the bundle. The baby was tiny, with a shock of dark hair and skin like porcelain. As Willa cradled her, the infant opened her eyes deep blue, like the sky after a storm. "She's perfect," Willa breathed, tears streaming down her face. Mason, who had rushed in from the barn at the sight of the Warner carriage, stood transfixed in the doorway. When he finally moved, it was to come to Willa's side, one large finger gently tracing the baby's soft cheek. "Hello, little one," he whispered. "We've been waiting for you." Elizabeth handed Mason an envelope. "The adoption papers, all legal and binding. She's yours now." After Elizabeth left, Willa and Mason sat side by side on the sofa, marveling at the miracle in their arms. "What shall we name her?" Mason asked. Willa thought for a moment. "Hope," she decided, "because that's what she is, hope made flesh." "Hope Holt," Mason tested the name. "It's perfect, just like her." The baby yawned, her tiny fingers curling around Willa's thumb with surprising strength. "I never thought I'd know this feeling," Willa said softly. Mason put his arm around her shoulders, drawing her close. "Life finds a way," he reminded her. "Sometimes not the way we expect, but always exactly the way it's meant to be." As the years passed, the Holt family flourished along with their homestead. The apple orchard became known throughout the territory for its quality fruit. They added a pear orchard, expanded their livestock, and built a larger home to accommodate their growing family, for Hope was not their only child. 2 years after Hope's arrival, they adopted twin boys whose parents had died in a stagecoach accident. 3 years after that, a young widow in town passed away from consumption, leaving behind a 4-year-old daughter who found a loving home with the Holts. By the time Willa and Mason celebrated their 10th wedding anniversary, their homestead had become one of the most prosperous in the county. Their dining table, built by Mason to accommodate their large family, was always surrounded by children's laughter and animated conversation. The Warners eventually sold their ranch and moved east, though Elizabeth maintained a correspondence with Willa until her passing. Silas Warner, humbled by a series of poor business decisions, ended up working as a clerk in a St. Louis mercantile. On their 20th anniversary, Mason surprised Willa with a special gift, a family portrait, painted by a traveling artist who had stayed at their farm in exchange for room and board. The painting showed Willa and Mason surrounded by their children and grandchildren, with Chance Roman III, grandson of the original puppy, faithfully at their feet. "You remember what I told you that night by the fire?" Mason asked as they stood admiring the portrait hanging above their mantel. "When you told me you couldn't have children," Willa nodded, her eyes misty with memory. "You've already brought me life," she quoted softly. "I meant it then," Mason said, his arm strong around her waist. "And I mean it even more now. Look what you've created, Willa. Look at the life that's flourished because of your love." Willa gazed at the portrait, at the faces of their children, now grown, and their grandchildren, at the home they had built together, at the life they had created from nothing but hope and determination. "We created it together," she corrected gently. "Life finds a way, but it's better when shared." As the sun set on another day in Montezuma, Willa Vaughn Holt stood in the orchard her mother had planted, watching her grandchildren chase fireflies among the apple trees. Mason joined her, his hair now fully silver but his blue eyes as clear and loving as the day they'd met. The doctor had been right about one thing: she would never bear children of her own. But he had been wrong about what that meant for her life. The family she and Mason had built might not share their blood, but they shared something far more important: their hearts, their home, their love. And in the end, that was the most precious legacy of all.